I am a child of the library. When I was a little boy in Jackson, Mississippi, was dumped by my mother in the library because in the summer we didn't have air conditioning, and it was a place where she could leave me and feel that I would be relatively safe. I wasn't completely safe, but I was relatively safe. I actually got my first bad review in the library. Somebody wrote on the bathroom wall that Richard Ford has the dirtiest mind in Jackson, Mississippi. And I have gone on to try to make a literary career out of that. If it's all right with you, I'll read something to you first, and then talk a little bit about this book, and then maybe read something to you, and then later, and then listen to what you all have on your minds, if by that time you have anything on your minds at all. You know, if you can't make the beginning of your book make sense, you're in the wrong line of work. So I'll read the beginning of this book. First, I'll tell about the robbery our parents committed, then about the murders which happened later. The robbery is the more important part, since it served to set my and my sister's lives on the courses they eventually followed. Nothing would make complete sense without that being told first. Our parents were the least likely two people in the world to rob a bank. They weren't strange people, not obviously criminals. No one would have thought they were destined to end up the way they did. They were just regular, although, of course, that kind of thinking became null and void the moment they did rob a bank. My father, Bev Parsons, was a country boy, born in Marengo County, Alabama in 1923, and came out of high school in 1939, burning to be in the Army Air Corps, the branch that became the Air Force. He went in at Demopolis, trained at Randolph near San Antonio, longed to be a fighter pilot, but lacked the aptitude, and so learned bombardiering instead. He flew the B-25s, the light-medium Mitchells that were seeing duty in the Philippines and later over Osaka, where they rained destruction on the earth, both on the enemy and undeserving people alike. He was a tall, winning, smiling, handsome 6-footer. He barely fitted into his bombardier's compartment. With a big, square, expectant face and knobby cheekbones and sensuous lips and long, attractive feminine eyelashes. He had white, shiny teeth and short, black hair he was proud of as he was of his name, Bev, Captain Bev Parsons. He never conceded that Beverly was a woman's name in most people's minds. It grew from Anglo-Saxon roots. He said, it's a common name in England. Vivian, Gwen, Shirley are men's names there. No one confuses them with women. He was a non-stop talker, was open-minded for a Southerner, had graceful, obliging manners that should have taken him far in the Air Force, but didn't. His quick hazel eyes would search around any room he was in, finding someone to pay attention to him, my sister and me ordinarily. He told corny jokes in a Southern theatrical style, could do card tricks and magic tricks, could detach his thumb and replace it, make a handkerchief disappear and come back. He could play boogie-woogie piano and sometimes would talk Dixie to us and sometimes like Amos and Andy. He had lost some of his hearing by flying the Mitchells and was sensitive about it. But he looked sharp in his honest GI haircut and blue captain's tunic and generally conveyed a warmth that was genuine and made my twin sister and me love him. It was also probably the reason my mother had been attracted to him, though they couldn't have been more unsuited and different, and unluckily gotten pregnant from their one hasty encounter after meeting at a party honoring returned airmen near where he was retraining to learn supply officer duties at Fort Lewis in March 1945, when no one needed him to drop bombs anymore. They were married immediately when they found out. Her parents, who lived in Tacoma and were Jewish immigrants from Poland, didn't approve. They were educated mathematics teachers and semi-professional musicians and popular concertizers in Poznan who'd escaped after 1918 and come to Washington State through Canada and became, of all things, school custodians. Being Jews meant little to them by then, or to our mother, just an old, exacting, constricted conception of life they were happy to put behind them in a land where there apparently were no Jews. But for their only daughter to marry a smiling, talkative only son of Scotch-Irish Alabama backwoods timber estimators was never in their thinking, and they soon put it out of their thinking altogether. And while from a distance it may seem that our parents were merely not made for one another, it was more true that when our mother married our father, it betokened a loss, and her life changed forever, and not in a good way, as she surely must have believed. My mother, Neva Camper, short for Geneva, was a tiny, intense, bespectacled woman with unruly brown hair, downy vestiges of which ran down her jawline. She had thick eyebrows and a shiny, thin-skinned forehead under which her veins were visible, and a pale indoor complexion that made her appear fragile, which she wasn't. My father jokingly said people where he was from in Alabama called her hair Jew hair or immigrant hair, but he liked it and loved her. She never seemed to pay these words much attention. She had small, delicate hands whose nails she kept manicured and shined and was vain about and gestured with absently. She owned a skeptical frame of mind, was an intent listener when we talked to her, and had a wit that could turn biting. She wore frameless glasses, read French poetry, often used terms like cauchemar or trou de coule, which my sister and I didn't understand. She wrote poems in brown ink bought through the mail and kept a journal we weren't permitted to read, and normally had a slightly nose-elevated, astigmatized expression of perplexity, which became true of her and may always have been true. Before she married my father and quickly had my sister and me, she'd graduated at 18 from Whitman College in Walla Walla, had worked in a bookstore, featured herself possibly as a bohemian and a poet, and had hoped someday to land a job as a studious small college instructor, married to someone different from who she did marry, conceivably a college professor, which would have given her the life she believed she was intended for. She was only 34 in 1960, the year these events occurred, but she already had serious lines beside her nose, which was small and pinkish at its tip, and her large, penetrating gray-green eyes had dusky lids that made her seem foreign and slightly sad and dissatisfied, which she was. She possessed a pretty thin neck and a sudden, unexpected smile that showed off her small teeth and girlish, heart-shaped mouth, though it was a smile she rarely practiced, except on my sister and me. We realized she was an unusual-looking person, dressed as she typically was in olive-color slacks and baggy-sleeved cotton blouses and hemp and cotton shoes she must have sent away to the West Coast for, since you couldn't buy such things in Great Falls, Montana. And she only seemed more unusual standing reluctantly beside our tall, handsome, outgoing father, though it was rarely the case that we went out as a family or ate in restaurants, so that we hardly noticed how they appeared in the world among strangers. To us, life in our house seemed normal. My sister and I could easily see why my mother would have been attracted to Bev Parsons, big, plank-shouldered, talkative, funny, forever wanting to please anybody who came in range, but it was never completely obvious why he would take an interest in her, tiny, barely 5 feet, inward and shy, alienated, artistic, pretty only when she smiled, and witty only when she felt completely comfortable. He must have somehow just appreciated all that, sensed she had a subtler mind than his, but that he could please her, which made him happy. It was to his good credit that he looked beyond their physical differences to the heart of things human, which I admired, even if it wasn't in our mother to notice. This book I started to think about in 1988, and which was a long time ago, I was living in a little wheat prairie town with my wife. We had been living in western Montana, and we just got tired of living in western Montana. We don't have any children, so we just sold our house and moved away. We didn't have any place to go. We just moved over to eastern Montana and rented a little horrible house And I had just finished a novel and was waiting around for it to come back from the editor. And while we were staying in this little horrible house, we would go pheasant shooting every afternoon, and I didn't have anything to do in the mornings. And so I thought, well, I'm a writer, I ought to write. So I rented a little room above a car repair and went up there every day with nothing on my mind. And I wrote 20 pages. And at the top of the 20 pages, I write with a pen. I still write with a pen, and it said Canada, and so I wrote 20 pages. I didn't know what it was or where it was going. I had no plans for it at all. I was just happy to be writing something I liked. And then my book came back from the editor, and I put those 20 pages into an envelope and put them in the freezer of my compartment of our refrigerator, and went on and finished the book that I was meant to finish, and then that led to something else. And every time I would think about going back to think about these pages that I wrote, I'm thinking, no, not now, not now. But I would take a note every day or so and stick it in this envelope. And so in the next 25 years, I did whatever I did, wrote other books that Charlie mentioned, and it came time for me to, well, I finished a book called The Lay of the Land, which was one of 3 connected books, and I thought, well, I'm done with this whole project now, these 3 connected books, this narrator, New Jersey, everything that I'd been writing about. And I thought, well, maybe it's time to go look in my freezer. And so I looked in my freezer, which is where I keep things. I keep all of my notes and all of my manuscript stuff in progress in the freezer, because that way the dogs won't get it and tear it up, or the cats. And I always then know where it is. It's an old habit from my mother, who grew up in northwest Arkansas. They were half Osage Indians, and they lived in pretty poor circumstances, and one of the poor part of their circumstances was that houses were always burning down. So she would stick any of their valuables, if they had any bonds, or if they had any, the marriage license, birth certificate, things like that, they would always stick them in the freezer. Well, they didn't have a freezer, they had a refrigerator. They stuck it in the refrigerator, and I just got in the habit of sticking my stuff in the refrigerator, which is where, if you go in my house today and open the refrigerator, you'll see a lot of dead animals and a bunch of manuscripts in progress. So I got out my big envelope that by then had 400 pieces of notes in it, and I spread them all over the room, and I just thought, well, there's a novel here, I think. What I wrote back in 1988 was just 20 pages about a boy being taken across the border from Montana into Saskatchewan, which is due north of Montana. And it was that piece of narration, just about a boy crossing a border against his will, that had for me what Catherine Ann Porter calls a commotion. If you ever read her Paris Review interview, she has a wonderful little anecdote about how she started to write The Flowering Judas, and about walking down a passageway where she was living in Mexico, and looking in a window and seeing a rather large young man on his knees in front of a rather comely girl, and he was wooing her, and it was just when she saw that through that window, that's all she saw. She had this little, I guess you would call it a kind of a frisson, but it's what Neruda calls algo golpeada en mi alma, something kicking in my soul. And when I wrote that little piece of business about this boy crossing over this national border to Canada, I had one of those little kickings in my soul. And when I looked back at all those notes that I had all those many years ago, because I never looked back at the pages that I wrote, because I thought if I looked back at the pages that I wrote, I'll be back in 1988 again, and maybe I wasn't a good enough writer to write that then. I had that algo in my soul again. And so I thought, well, there's something here. There's something about crossing a border that needs to have language dedicated to it. So then I thought, well, what would cause a boy to have to leave his parents and go across a national border against his will? What could have happened to his parents? And I just did the kind of thing novelists do. I started dreaming stuff up, I thought, well, they could die. And I thought, well, if they died, then I don't want to write about that. What do I want to write about? And I thought, well, they could rob a bank. So I thought I'd like to write about robbing a bank. I think that's something I always thought would be a great thing to get to at least see some people do. And when I was a boy, I had robbed a lot of things and stolen a lot of things. And fortunately, my mother had talked me out of it just at a very crucial point, because the guy I was doing it with went to prison, and I would have gone there too. But I sort of backed out just at the right moment. But there was some business left untried, so I could try it, as often is the case. You know, Randall Gerald says that a writer is sometimes not the person who does the thing, but the person who needs to do it. Maybe I needed to rob a bank, and I could rob it by writing about someone robbing it. So I used that as my pretext, and then I had to make up what was actually going to happen when he got to Canada, which is where the murders come in. I wanted to write a book. I mean, I have like all novelists, whether we actually succeed at this or not, I have always had in my mind sort of models for the sorts of book I thought I ought to be writing. I wanted to write literary books which subscribed to the Leavis injunction that literature is the supreme means by which we renew our sensuous and emotional life and learn a new awareness. But I also wanted to write books in which guns go off, in which people rob banks. So in other words, I wanted that for what is for me the perfect story, sort of like The Great Gatsby, you know. You have serious things going on, and you also have shoot-em-ups. And a book like Robert Stone's book, Dog Soldiers, is a perfectly good example of this book. That's my sort of model book in my mind. So I thought, here's my chance to write my model book. So in fact, that's then what I did. I spent the next year sort of dreaming up what this book would be. The book is about this boy who actually is, because his parents rob a bank, taken across the border and put into the hands of a man who is basically, unwitting to everyone, a psychopath. And he has to find his way out of that dilemma. And the book is in 3 parts. First part is in the United States, the second part is in Canada, the third part is also in Canada, set where all books should finally end, in Windsor, Ontario, about this man in his late age, in his middle to late 60s, retiring from his job as a teacher and telling this story, as is the case of most first-person narratives. Most first-person narratives in which you look back at a time in which life was young and you were young, are about the whole matter of being able to tell it. If I can tell it, I can accept it. If I can tell it, I can make it make sense at that late age. There's a line of Seamus's, and he says, I think he says it in his little poem called The Harvest Bow. He says, the end of art is peace. And in a way, that's the end of this book. This book tries to find a kind of what Seamus otherwise calls assent. When he gets to the end of a poem, Seamus always wants, or did want, because he's gone now, he always wanted to find some measure of assent, A-S-S-E-N-T. So that's what I wanted my book to achieve at the end of it, which is what I tried to do. And I'll read... not the end. I'm not going to read the end. That would just cheat me if I read the end of it to you. But I'll read a little bit. I'll read a little bit from chapter 68, which takes place in Windsor, Ontario. I have always counseled my students to think on the long life of Thomas Hardy, born 1840, died 1928. To think on all he saw, the changes his life comprehended over such a period. I try to encourage in them the development of a life concept, to enlist their imaginations to think of their existence on the planet not as just a catalog of random events endlessly unspooling, but as a life, both abstract and finite. This as a way of taking account. I teach them books that to me seem secretly about my own young life: The Heart of Darkness, The Great Gatsby, The Sheltering Sky, the Nick Adams stories, The Mayor of Casterbridge, A Mission into the Void, Abandonment, A Figure, possibly mysterious, but finally not. These books aren't taught now in high schools in Canada. Who knows why? My conceit is always crossing a border, adaptation, development from a way of living that doesn't work toward one that does. It can also be about crossing a line and never being able to come back. Along the way, I tell them, if not the facts, at least some of the lessons of my long life, that to encounter me now at age 66 is to be unable to imagine me at 15, which will be true of them, and not to hunt too hard for hidden or opposite meanings, even in the books they read, but to look as much as possible straight at the things they can see in broad daylight. In the process of articulating to yourself the things you see, you'll always pretty well make sense and learn to accept the world. It may not seem precisely natural to them to do this. One of them will often say, "I don't see what this has to do with us." I say back, does everything have to be about you? Can you not project yourself outside yourself? Can you not take on another's life for your own benefit? It's then that I'm tempted to tell them about my young life in its entirety, to tell them teaching is a gesture of serial non-abandonment of them, the vocation of a boy who loved school. I always feel I have a lot to teach them and not much time. A bad sign. Retirement comes for me at a good moment. It's well and long accepted that I'm an American, though I've been naturalized and have held a passport for 35 years. I decades ago married a Canadian girl fresh from college in Manitoba. I own my house on Monmouth Street in Windsor, Ontario. Have taught English at the Walkerville Collegiate Institute since 1981. My colleagues are polite about my forsaken Americanness. Occasionally, someone asks if I don't long to go back. I say, not at all. It's right there across the river. I can see it. They seem both supportive of my choices. Canadians think of themselves as natural acceptors, tolerators, understanders, but also are impatient nearly to the point of resentment that I even had to make a choice. My students, who are 17 and 18, are generally amused by me. They tell me I talk like a Yank, even though I don't, and tell them there's no difference. I tell them it's not hard to be a Canadian. Kenyans and Indians and Germans do it with ease. And I had so little training to be American anyway. They want to know if I was a draft dodger long ago. Why they even know about that, I can't fathom, since history is not what they study. I tell them I was a Canadian conscript, and Canada saved me from a fate worse than death, which they understand to mean America. Sometimes they jokingly ask me if I changed my name. I assure them I did not. Impersonation and deception, I tell them, are the great themes of American literature, but in Canada, not so much. Well, that's enough to read from this book.